I suppose this video is going to be a little bit long and difficult to make. I'm sure I'm going to struggle in articulating what it is that I want to articulate. These ideas are, some of them are not so new to me. Some of them are pretty new. Some of them are other people's ideas. A lot of them are my own. And as I am in the process of thinking about this, conceptualizing everything that I want to articulate, I'm not sure I have fully synthesized all of that together, but maybe I do that because well, that always leaves room for improvement, right? Anyway, so I got a problem with nationalism because, well, nationalists, right? People who are pro nationalism want to push this idea that it's natural, right? Now, offhand, I'm very skeptical of this sort of terminology because no one really defines what that means, right? Depending on where you draw the line between natural and, let's say, artificial, anything could be natural or everything could be artificial. Maybe not exactly that, but it is a pretty arbitrary distinction, right? It's kind of meaningless, right? But what I think they mean to say when they use the term natural when it comes to nationalism is that it's innately in us, that it's instinctual, that it just exists, right? We have maybe a propensity for nationalism. And that's not necessarily wrong, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I don't think nationalism, the whole of nationalism, is what some people will call a natural phenomenon or something that just, it's not a grassroots movement. It isn't. I think that's what people mean to say more than anything, that it's somehow grassroots and that it's ours and all of ours, us, who are this, right? No, that is so blatantly not true. Uh, If it's so frustrating that people can't see this, how untrue this is, right? Nationalism is an ideology. Now, what's an ideology? Well, it's an idea, or going off memory here, a set of ideas about the world, how things are, right? Or more properly, how they should be, right? Which, as it is that, imposes, suggests, dictates some kind of normative behavior, right? Nationalism is a set of ideas about the world that proposes that this is the way things should be, right? And if not everybody, a certain group of people should have these ideas and should lead their lives in accordance with these ideas, right? It's taken an idea such as that a certain group of people are connected by blood, myth, um, whatever it is, right? History. And because of that, they should act a certain way, right? They should have each other's interest in mind and have each other's interest above the interest of people from a different nation, right? That there is a people, a nation, and they should in some way prefer each other to people from other nations, right? I'm taking sips coffee off camera, so to speak, um, to collect my thoughts also. Look, as an ideology, right? This is as long as I've been alive and understood ideology, right? Once I became aware of what it is and how it works, I can't think of a single instance when an ideology sprung up in the heads of a whole bunch of different people, be they related or not, doesn't matter, right? Independent of one another, and and they had the same idea, right? All at the same time. All something I talked about in my previous video on nationalism. This is they won't come out and say it outright, nationalists, right? But that's the implication, that all these people in this people group had this idea. The same thing occurred to them more or less at the same time, or what's more believable, I suppose, is that that idea was somehow in them from the very beginning, right? And it's natural for them to feel this and act on this feeling, right? So this is, and that's another problem I have with nationalism. It's emotionally based, right? It's not necessarily very reasonable. It isn't. If that's the basis for human cooperation, right? Then it's, I mean, just listen to what these people are telling you, the defenders of nationalism, right? It's based in myth. What? Where's the virtue in that? It's based in a story, perhaps, right? Doesn't matter if it's true or if it isn't true. Well, that sounds postmodernist, does it not? A little bit, maybe? But maybe I'm getting postmodernism wrong. Anyway, no, that's not what nationalism is, because nationalism is an ideology, right? So what it is a set of ideas, once again, being imposed on a larger group by a smaller group or an individual, right? Why do we have these defenders of nationalism, right? These scholars, people who go up to the podium and tell you what it is, right? And why it should be so. Define it for you, right? And tell you, oh, those people using that word, they're wrong. I'm right. Okay. Why? Have they ever given a justification for why they're right and those other people there are wrong? No. Like a valid, sound justification? No. This is what we want it to be. So the contention, what was the guy's name? We talked about Keith Woods talking about Walker. Sorry, I forgot his name now. Walker Carroll, I think, was something like that, right? So Walker Connor, right? That's the one of the scholars, right? And this is one of his ideological students, followers, right? This guy here, Keith Woods, who doesn't really, does he? I don't know. Doesn't really question his guru. He's a repeater, right? He's a Xerox machine. So in the mainstream, right, nationalism is an idea and movement that holds that the nation state should, right? This is the ideology, should be congruent with the state, right? And Walker Connor over here, or Keith Woods, says bullshit, right? It's more complex than that, maybe, or it's not necessarily so. Okay, but who's right? Right? Who's right? Who's wrong? Can you tell me who's right and who's wrong? And justify that, give a proper or valid justification. You can't. You can't do it. It's just how you feel, right? That's what it's based on. Emotion, feeling, maybe, and I think this is true for a lot of people in power. Political reasons dictate how you define nationalism, right? Whatever's clever. But when you actually look at the world as it exists today, right? Well, that's what nationalism is. That is, more often than not, what it is, nationalism, right? How does Walker Connor get to tell you that those people are wrong, right? What justification does he have? He doesn't have one. He just wishes it were this way, right? So he is in a way opposed to this mainstream view of nationalism, right? He has a different ideological slant, if you will, right? But this is what it is in the world that we live today, right? It's this idea that the nation state, the nation is congruent with the state, which is where you get terms such as nation state, right? Something that Walker Connor rebels against. He says that's wrong, right? This is why when people talk about, you know, the Russian army, a lot of whom ain't into what they're doing, really. They're forced to do this, right? And they have mixed support from the Russian people, right? At the behest of one leader or a small group of leaders, right? When they attack, broadly speaking, Ukraine, right? This land, because it's a territorial struggle. It has nothing to do to go on a bit of a tangent, right? To just to once again vent some frustration at how fucking stupid and incoherent you right-wing woke motherfuckers are. Oh, had to get that off my chest, right? Because the idea was that, and this is part of the problem, just to bring it back home, of nationalism, right? You're so fucking brainwashed by this nonsense, you can't see the forest from the fucking trees, right? So the justification for the right-wing wokes for Putin going into Ukraine was to, save and protect the Russian people, right? Because Russian people have been dying in the Donbass, right? Without getting into the complexities and intricacies of that war that grew into this one, right? Had been going on for something like 8 years, in which, I don't remember exactly, something like 20,000 people died, right? On both sides, maybe. So let's say 10,000 Russians, maybe, right? So if the goal is to, do you see how ridiculous that's, how fucking dishonest do you have to be to spit that shit? Seriously. Or fucking ignorant, right? If the goal is to protect and save Russian people, well, how many people died during, just Russians, right? Forget about Ukrainians. And why is it, this is the nationalism, right? Why is it that Russians' lives are worth more than Ukrainians' lives? Why? Justify that. You can't, right? Um, Man, I wish this shit would just end. Sorry. But yeah, that's your stupid fucking nationalism brainwashing you, right? Or somehow the nationalism of the Russian people is somehow more important than the nationalism of the Ukrainian people, right? Because Ukrainian nationalists, right? Well, they're Nazis. It's in the fucking name, right? That's who Nazis are, National Socialists, right? Ukrainian nationalists are Nazis, right? And the Russians, with their Z and their Roman salute or whatever it is they do over there, right? Well, those are nationalists, right? Wagner Group and all this other shit, right? So those are bad nationalists and those are good nationalists. They're all just nationalists, right? This is what where nationalism gets you, right? It gets people to kill one another. I'm sorry, this is what it is, but it's natural, right? Yeah, okay. Then go kill, right? We have even to this day, perhaps, right? We have cannibals because it's natural. So go kill whichever side you fall on, right? Go kill those people and eat them because it's natural. It's this fucking retarded shit, man. Anyway, so yeah, where was I? Sorry, I had to take a sip of my coffee, which I will do once again on camera this time, and then some. So yeah, these if really, obviously, right, if the goal was to protect, right, and take care of Russian people, Well, I mean, how many Russian people did Putin send to their death, right? So far. In the last 8 months, we don't really know the numbers, but what is it, 100,000 Russians that were killed in this war so far, right? Many times more, in 10 times, or just less, however, I don't know, 8 months to 8 years, you do the math, right? 15 times, yeah, that's it, I think. He had 15 times less time, right, than the 8 year long war in Donbass, and he got what, 5 times as many Russians killed. So if the goal is to, and it's not like this wasn't predictable. Of course, this was predictable, right? If the goal was to protect Russian people, well, I mean, come on, really, really, we're still saying this, right? But I guess you could have used that justification had he just gone into the Donbass and you know did what he had to do there, right? Why the fuck did he wait 8 years, right? Did he not? Did he not have enough dead Russians to convince more Russians to be dead Russians? Nationalism, though, right? But look, I'm not saying that nationalism necessarily has to lead to this, but in the wrong hands, it always does. And well, who's in power? Mostly wrong people, right? That's not a pragmatic characterization, I guess, if you will, criticism. It's because it's merit based. These people get to these positions of power based on their own merit, but it is morally wrong, right? These people have they don't believe in morality, right? Obviously. Anyway, so I told you this was going to be long and difficult. So yeah, like how do you right wing wokes, right? If you're so pro nationalism, right? How do you support what the Russians are doing because nationalism, and then have a problem with what the Ukrainians are doing, right? Well, how? They're the ones whose statehood has been and whose nation has been threatened, right? More so than look, this idea that Putin he's paranoid, right? He's got the biggest country. He's at the helm of the biggest country on the planet, one of the most populous, or maybe not that necessarily, but definitely millions of people, right? That he's trying to brainwash with this Russian nationalism, right? Erase their culture. Speaking of nationalism, why isn't the Chechen nationalism important to you guys, right? Why did the Chechens have to be Russian? Because nationalism? You're fucking incoherent. You don't make any sense. This is what your nationalism leads to. I'm just looking at what you do and the things that you say, those of you that do, and I'm just commenting on it, right? That's all I'm doing. Anyway, yeah, if anyone's nation has been threatened, right, it's been the Ukrainians. Whether it was the Polish kingdom or government that wanted to assimilate them, right, and tried a little bit, or it was, the Tsar, USSR, and now Putin, same fucking shit. At the end of the day, it's the Ukrainian nationalism that has been threatened the most, right? Even though that is Ukraine, right? Those people right there, they are. There would be no Russia if it wasn't for Kiev, right? That's where Russia's historical roots come from, right? And yet somehow, right, we are to believe that the people that are still living in this area, in that area to that day, still speaking a different enough language from both Poles and the Ukrainians, even though and the Russians, even though to me it sounds like it's a lot closer to Polish than it is to Russian, right? Somehow those people, right, still holding, because of how fiercely nationalistic they have been for a long, 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 long time, right? And they've been able to survive the little bit of Polish interference and what, like 1,000 years or so by now of Russian interference, both more or less trying to erase their nationality, right? Those people have survived in that very area from which we got Russia and what is today Ukraine, right? They've survived, they've preserved their language, or it's evolved, whatever. This is who they are, right? At the birthplace of both Russia and Ukraine, right? And yet somehow the Muscovites, right? Something that came a little bit later, right? Or maybe out of that, right? Somehow the Muscovites are the originators when that came later. You know what I mean? Which isn't to say that Ukraine hasn't transformed also because of all the influences from outside. Yeah, I mean, culture is dynamic, right? Nationalism, I guess so too, along with culture, traditions, so on and so forth. But that's like saying that well, that's like saying Palestine is Jewish, right? These like Russian Jews and German Jews get to go to Palestine because that's theirs somehow, right? Not the people that are there, right? That's kind of the same thing, right? It's this same fucking retarded idea. All you Russia shills, right? Saying that that's Russian somehow. Well, maybe Russia should be Ukrainian, right? I'm not saying that either, but that is the birthplace of both Russia and Ukraine. And who's held on to? I'm not talking about borders, right? I'm talking about culture and identity. Who's held on to those lands, despite the fact that they've been trying to exterminate them, right? Well, that which became Ukrainians. But somehow those are Russian lands. Fucking retards, man. So spare me your fucking. If you're gonna be nationalist, fair enough. At the very least, be fucking coherent, right? No, but it's not about nationalism, right? It's about me. That's ultimately what this fucking comes down to, right? Feelings. You can't justify it. Am I making sense yet? Anyway, so yeah, there's this schism in the studies of nationalism, right? One, the majority says that nationalism is an idea and movement that holds that the state should be congruent with the nation with the state, right? And Walker Connor rebels against that, right? Because maybe it's gone a little bit too far, right? So look, I keep saying how nationalism is a step necessary for globalism, which is why it's allowed to continue, and it's important to the globalists that it does exist, right? They want to take that sort of, they want to brainwash people with this and then steer it in the direction they want to go. And the same goes for those who are anti-globalist and fiercely nationalistic, right? It's still a small group of people dictating to a larger group of people how they should behave for their own political goals, right? So if you have these fierce nationalists like maybe the Hungarian president or the president of some of these European countries pushing for nationalism, well, they could be anti-globalist. I don't know. They could be because they want more power for themselves, right? But it's not because they care for the people. They need to use the people to maintain their power. While at the same time, there are people above them, if you will, who like the idea of nationalism, but they want to be able to kind of control it and steer it in the way they want to, right? So maybe this is what we're having here playing out, right? This idea that nationalism is the state, congruent with the state, and then Walker Connor's idea of an ethno state, which he says there are fewer of in the world. Not every nation state is an ethno state. Even though literally it means the same thing, he has his own distinction, which I think I did a good enough job describing here, right? So, like, he would call Japan an ethno state, right? Because, well, it's basically one nationality, like 98% or something like that. of Japan is the same nation, right? Whereas that's not necessarily true of other countries, like the multi-culti places, right? And yet, which is weird because even using his own idea of what a nation is, you could very well argue that those are nations too, right? That those are ethno-states too, or they're in the process of becoming ethno-states, right? Because it's all fucking arbitrary, right? Because if nationality is based on a myth, first and foremost, well, you could create any myth you want, right? Given enough time, you could convince black and white and yellow and green and orange people that they're all part of the same nation because they have the same myth, right? And he says that uh, blood ties aren't all that important necessarily, right? Well, then there you have it. And even if they are, that's at the end of the day, that's still arbitrary, right? I'm not saying that blood ties are arbitrary. I'm saying where you draw the line, because ultimately, at the end of the day, we're all probably related, or enough of us are somewhat related, where we could, depending on how broad, how big we draw that circle, right? Black and white people could very well be part of the same nation because they're somewhat related. Where is that distinction, right? It's not race based, right? It isn't. Okay then. Oh, race, by the way, is another false dialect that I've been meaning to talk about. Race, by the way, is you have, the right wing wokes saying that it's all genetic, right? And it's all bloodlines. And then you have the left wing wokes saying that it's a social construct. No, dummies, it's both, right? Obviously, natural bloodlines or blood relationships, genetic similarity exists, obviously, right? But where we draw that line, right, is socially constructed, right? What we define as race is completely and utterly socially constructed. So it's both, right? It's a false dialectic. This is how they brainwash you with fucking nonsense. Anyway, gee, tangents, my favorite thing. Let me take a sip of my coffee. So yeah, there seem to be two opposing ideas of what nationalism is, and I think various elites use these ideas for their own gain. They brainwash people with nationalism. And then this is what they're doing, right? And then they try to define it in a certain way that serves their purposes and goals, right? And Walker Connor is in a minority, and he's rebelling against the mainstream idea, maybe because he sees where that leads, right? If he's still alive. It leads to globalism, right? Just as I told you, nationalism is a step necessary for globalism. Why? Well, because if nationality is based on a myth and a set of arbitrary characteristics, right? Well, then who's to say that you couldn't convince enough people one day that everybody on this planet is part of one and the same nation? And that's exactly what they're trying to do, right? We're all one human race. One day we're all going to blend to be kind of brown with somewhat curly hair. You know what I mean? Right? There's a push to, most of the world probably, geographically anyway, understands English to some degree, right? So we're moving in that direction. Then there's also, you're seeing English language phrases sneak into all these different languages, be it Spanish or whatever, man, right? More increasingly, the whole world is speaking more and more English, right? You also have, I don't know what to call it, digital language. Think of it as you will, right? Emojis are becoming part of universally recognized language, right? We're all increasingly dressing the same, right? We participate. We're all starting to eat the same food, right? This is just a global culture, right? So couldn't you one day create a myth? And that's where this is headed, right? Once you brainwash people with this idea that like a common myth, right? A common language, fucking ridiculous. Common cuisine, living in living in the same geographical area, right? Well, don't we all live on the same planet, right? And once you convince people that that's what's important first and foremost, right, in creating cohesion, unity, and cooperation, or mm, I don't know if those are the proper terms, but uh, maybe, but still dictated. Whatever that means is still dictated from up top and above, right? Once you convince, once you slowly create this global culture, right? Well, then we all become one nation state, right? Because that's what it's based on, right? So you see how nationalism leads to globalism, but I think some people have woken up and they see where that's headed, and they don't want to give up the power. And I'm not saying Walker is necessarily that guy, or his student is necessarily that guy, because I don't think, sometimes, as counterintuitive as it may seem, a lot of these very intelligent people, they don't actually get what's going on, right? They just latch onto an idea because it feels good, right? They don't, ideologues, they don't question their own premises, or whether or not they even have premises to the things, to the conclusions that they make about the world, right? They just latch onto these ideas because they sound good. Well, what does that mean? It feels good, right? Well, why does it feel good? Well, because probably because you were brainwashed to think that these things are good. If you can't justify them, right, why these things feel good, well, then where did it come from? Well, someone brainwashed you from very little that these things are good. It's not your internal moral compass deciding these things. Probably, I don't know. Anyway, so you're seeing some fierce nationalist, ethno nationalist, right? Uh, nationalist reaction to globalism. Yeah, that's definitely true. And to a lot of people, that's like a lifeline, right? Or a life raft, right? And drowning in this ocean of globalism, somebody throws them uh, an inflatable device to hold on to, right? And float just a little bit longer. Um, in the world of hunger for identity, or some kind of self, quote unquote, self definition, right? Somebody throws them a bone and they latch onto it. And it is that sort of nationalism, right? In a sense, it's dual, because it is a reaction to globalism, and it is anti-globalist in a sense. So that's why a lot of people latch onto it also. But at the same time, this is something that I talk about often enough. This is two steps forward, one step back, because ultimately, at the end of the day, nationalism, it's still nationalism, right? If you brainwash enough people with this idea of nationalism, a lot of them aren't necessarily going to be able to conceptualize of it in the way I'm trying to articulate here, right? All the pitfalls, and what it is, what it should it be anything, should it even exist, right? Like, they'll bypass all that. They'll just think nationalism, 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 right? So once they're primed, let's say, by these ultra nationalists with this idea of nationalism, well, who's to say they can't, that's going to be easier to sway them in the direction of global nationalism, right? And especially with, ultimately, at the end of the day, once they have that nationalistic primer, it just takes, because it came from a certain leader, right? It just takes the replacing of the leaders to be like, oh, well, that was a good idea he had, but this is the correct kind of nationalism now. So now that you're a nationalist, well, we get to define what that is, right? And all you know is that, well, nationalism is good. Why? Because nationalism, right? That's how the rank and file think of these things. They don't think of these things, right? It's just a feeling thing. But that's what you guys are telling me, right? You're telling me that you feel kinship, right, with some dude that lives hundreds of kilometers away, simply because you believe you don't even know this dude, right? Simply because in your head you have this idea that this mythical person, right, speaks the same language and has a similar culture and is somewhat more related to you than someone from Zimbabwe. Okay, and so what, right? It's this idea that you should hold people of the same nation above other people somehow, right? Now think of how untenable that is, if that's the right word, or how stupid it is, right? So if someone from Zimbabwe, let's say, murders someone from your nation, right? Versus someone from that same nation murders another person from that nation. Same circumstances, same type of murder, right? Whatever, premeditated, so on and so forth. Well, because nationalism, right? Who do we punish worse? Who gets a greater punishment? The outsider or the insider? Who? Well, it should be the outsider, right? Because, well, he's not part of our nation. Yeah, but a guy that's part of your nation, why is he murdering another member of your nation? Which is a whole nother problem for nationalism, right? Well, maybe that guy, right? Because supposedly he has this like innate natural feeling for of kinship and blah 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 toward the person, like for him to forego, ignore all of that and still kill someone of the same nation, well then maybe he should be punished more than the outsider, right? But then you're not, but then like but that's your kin. How are you going to treat your kin so much worse than the outsider? Oh, well, let's just treat them the same then. Oh, okay, well then where's the nationalism in that? This idea that people have some sort of kinship, right? Simply because they eat the same food, they have similar, same culture, however you arbitrarily define that. You can't. The only way you could define that is by putting borders between people, I think, right? And then it becomes a little bit different because there's less of a cultural exchange across borders. And then you could justify, oh, look, this culture is different than that culture. But was it really? There were no clearly dividing lines in the past, right? They didn't really exist because cultures just blended. Now, not necessarily, not in all cases, because whatever, it's too complex to get into. But nationalism, in the way, and this is the ignorance of someone like Walker, right? Nationalism, insofar as it exists today, could not have existed in the way that it does without borders. It couldn't have. So to completely deny that the state and has an influence on what the nation looks like, with all of its institutions dictating cultural and political and otherwise life, right? That's just ignorant. It's none of that. It's just this feeling that we all naturally have. No, we don't. You don't feel anything for some stranger that's running around committing crimes all over the place other than hate, disdain, pity, right? Or any of these nationalistic or feelings that nationalism brings about. So what am I getting at, right? What I'm getting at is the genesis of nationalism. So in my view, right, in my limited, somewhat ignorant view, a lot of which is based in, written word by these so-called historians and things that I've heard, and also just how I imagine things to be, right? And I don't just pull these ideas out of my ass, though, right? I try to be logical, reasonable, rational. Nationalism is not something that sprouted out. It was never a grassroots movement, right? In a way that it just, this idea sprouted out in the minds of people independent of one another, and they all came to this consensus together, right? There was always a central authority or a elite group of people who imposed the ideology, some sort of normative behavior on a larger group of people for political gain. That's nationalism. It's always been that way. Walker Connor is doing the exact same thing, right? He wants to be recognized as, and he has been, right, as a revolutionary nationalist thinker, some sort of a leader, right? If only spiritual, whatever the fuck, right? That's what he is. And then you got these people blindly following him without questioning what it is that he's saying, somehow pretending that this idea was theirs in the first place, right? When did you, if you are, right, become a nationalist or aware of this sort of thing that is nationalism? Well, somebody on TV or some book or some pedagogue at school presented you with this idea, defined it for you, and then it became, quote unquote, your own, right? Isn't that how it happened? When did you become a nationalist? And why weren't you that from the day you were born or old enough, like maybe 9 to 10, to start to conceptualize something like that, what that is, without people telling you that, oh, well, this person speaks your language, they're part of the same country as you, they're your countrymen, you need to be respectful of them, patriotic, blah, 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 this and that, blah, blah, without any interference or education or brainwashing from anybody around you. Would you have even be a nationalist? I mean, if it's so organic and whatever, like we should be able to, no, maybe that's not fair, but you would think, right, if this is so if nationalism is so grassroots and organic, whatever the fuck you want to call it, right, natural, shouldn't most people be nationalists? Why aren't they? Right? Shouldn't that be the prevailing ideology? If it's just so obvious and innate, should more of us be that? Shouldn't it look the same? Why is there a dispute as to what that is, right? Well, because that power structure, or those people who want to be in power, want to pull you in their direction, and then there's another group pulling you in their direction. That's why, right? Why does it even have a name, such as nationalism, which is an ideology, right? First you get an idea, and then you brainwash people with it. That's a very crude and perhaps a little bit unfair description of ideology, but that's kind of what it is, right? Veganism. It's easy to see that when it comes to veganism, but somehow nationalism is, no, that's different. Yeah, is it? I'm gonna sip of my coffee before we wrap up this video. 8 more minutes, let's say. Let's try. So, but I don't mean to, because there is something to it, right? I don't mean to discount this idea of kinship, right? Obviously, people are related to people, right? And I'm talking about more immediate relationships, ones that we could actually track, right? Not this imagined shit, which is just the expansion of the natural, if you will, clan or tribe even, right? It's people in a certain geographical area that fuck one another and make babies, right? And those people's babies have more babies, right? That's a family, a clan, right? Yeah, that's how things naturally evolved, if you will, right? I ain't talking about Darwin here. I'm just talking about people groups. So, yeah, obviously, people that have lived in a certain geographical area and made it with one another, coupled and stuck together and took care of each other, that obviously that sort of kinship always existed, right? And those were clans and maybe even tribes, right? But then those tribes got united because the leaders of the tribes came together, right? And whether by means of a common enemy and I think it's the desire for more power and more control, they started uniting these tribes together and growing these human families, right? Uh, but that whatever it was back in those days, and maybe you couldn't call it nationalism, that required an ideology already, because living together in a certain group where we, grow our own food, or we hunt it, or we protect one another from the elements, or maybe even other people if need be. But this sort of like tribal warfare, that's not very organic. People think that it's just natural that people kill each other, right? When they run into different people groups, they kill each other. No, 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 no. There's anthropological studies, which I won't be getting into here right now, that suggest that isn't necessarily so. They're not necessarily, they don't necessarily have a friendly disposition to one another, but they don't exterminate each other either. They actually mate together, right? In order to, which is interesting. Maybe I will go on a bit of a tangent, but Aborigine tribes in Australia, I think that's who I'm thinking of here, they would run into one another and they would barter, right? They weren't part of the same, they weren't on the same team, if you will, and they were very skeptical of one another and not necessarily very friendly, but they would barter and they would have sex with different members of between these tribes, right? Which helped them to maintain a certain kind of genetic variation where they didn't become too inbred. And yeah, then the village would raise a child, so to speak, right? That that came by bloodlines, was not of that tribe, and yet was completely assimilated, became a member of that tribe, so on and so forth, right? So it was a different bloodline, but ultimately that didn't matter. Why? Well, because that kid grew up and took care of the tribe, right? So this is the distinction between what do we call it? Pragmatism, survivalism, just doing things that make sense naturally, right? Rather than, and again, be skeptical of naturally, right? But organically, I guess, rather than doing things because some central authority tells us to do them that way, right? But eventually, again, at some point, a leader, you know what I mean, tribes started uniting at the behest of central authorities and leaders, right? These weren't necessarily group decisions that were made. It came to a point where you had to brainwash enough people, convince them that this is in your best interest to do this, and maybe it was, and that's how these people groups grew and became what we know today as nations, right? But it wasn't all grassroots necessarily, or organic or natural, right? There was that element of power by a central authority and the desire to just be more powerful and rule over more and more people. At least that's the way I see it. So, and from that you got nationalism, which to a certain point maybe was quote unquote good for us, maybe, right? But if you keep moving in that direction, right, then how globalism is inevitable, right? Isn't it? Anyway, obviously you need technology and communication and advancements and all those fields. Yeah, I get it. But the reason why people did things the way they did is because it made sense, right? It made sense. We needed one another to produce all the things we needed to survive, right? To protect ourselves from the elements and wild animals, so on and so forth. And sometimes, in some cases, uh, hostile people, right? So that made sense. That was, I would say, organic, right? It was pragmatic. It had little to do with feeling, and it was a rational decision, right? And from that sprouted out nationalism, right? Which can be all those things. It can, But it isn't. I mean, just look at what nationalism is doing, right? We could have all these, hold all these lofty ideals about how beautiful it is, how natural it is, how it makes sense, how it's like virtuous. But those are just ideas. Where are the arguments that it is, right? Because when you actually look at the way the world exists, has nationalism made it better or worse? I thought so, right? Are you, once again, are you able to think rationally? Or has nationalism fucked you up to a point where you can't even make sense of any of this shit? You're fucking incoherent, right? Because once again, just to bring you back to that example, somehow you're a nationalist, supposedly you're pro-nationalism, but what Russians are doing is good, and the nationalists that are defending themselves from being attacked by the Russians, they're bad somehow, right? But if you're a nationalist, shouldn't you just be a nationalist and support both people in killing each other? Or fight for peace, right? You shouldn't be taking sides. If you're a nationalist, why are you taking sides? Right? It doesn't make any fucking sense. Not to me. So yeah, long story short, nationalism was never in our interest as people, and it still isn't. I'm talking about all of us. It still isn't. Yeah, it's a little step back from, it's a lesser evil in a way. You know, if globalism is two steps forward, nationalism is globalism, but it's also that one little step back, right? It's like this little thing we could cling on to slow down the beast that is globalism, right? And globalism doesn't, nothing, I don't think anyway, is inherently evil about globalism. But unfortunately, with globalism comes, globalism, nationalism, they're essentially the same. One's just bigger, right? And you could argue that globalism, I have, right? You need nationalism to bring about globalism, global nationalism, right? So, in closing, there's virtue in cooperating, taking care of one another, and making sense of this world around us, and using it with all of its resources for our, you know, well-being, if you will, well-being, welfare, prosperity, survival. Yeah, there's definitely virtue in all of that, right? That's good. But I think with the introduction of nationalism, this is what I mean when I say, and I don't know if this is exactly the correct way to look at it, but it's when I call ideology reverse, it's reverse engineering reality, right? What was a very natural, pragmatic way of being, acting, these various considerations we had of one another, and how we related to one another, right? They just made sense. It wasn't like you had to, it's not like you have to teach an animal. And again, I'm not saying we're animals. You have to brainwash an animal on how to survive in its environment, right? It just knows how to do it naturally. That is natural, right? That was natural, us, the way we were way back in the day. But then, once again, authoritarians stepped in, or people who yearned for power and needed to convince people to externalize that power and give it to them. They eventually came up with this idea of nationalism, and they tried to sell it to you as something that's very natural, when once again it doesn't make sense, as I already pointed out. It gave you many instances, and it gave you proof that this isn't natural. It's just an ideology, right? But it got blended together, melded, is that the term? Together with these pragmatic, natural, uh, this pragmatic, natural behavior that's rational and exists. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But you externalize all that, and it got blended with this idea of nationalism, and now you're being told that it was always thus. No, nationalism is a relatively new concept, right? Relatively new, even if it's in some places of the world a couple thousand, even 10,000 years old. It's still, relative to how long we've been here, I believe, a new concept that came out of a desire for power, necessity, maybe, to control. And yeah, you could say that it's natural because everything is, right, depending on where you draw that line. But it's not. But it's not at the core who we are, right? Because you don't actually feel anything, not organically, for a complete another fucking stranger that's coming into your garage and taking your bicycle. Other than you don't have any good fluffy feelings for them. It doesn't matter that they eat the same food as you, speak the same language, uh, and share culture, right? They're still a fucking thief, and if you could, you'd fucking pluck his eyes out or something, right? Yeah, but they're your brother, right? Are they? No, that's something earned. That's not being your brother's keeper, if you will, or part of the same uh, people group that has virtue at its foundation, right? Well, that should be based on how we act, right? And I'm going way over time, but try to warn you. There's no virtue to nationalism, is what I'm saying, because it's not based in virtue, right? Because you can, even when you look at like sports, for example, right? Boxing is a good example of this. Simply because a fighter is a Mexican, right? A lot of Mexicans will support him despite the fact that he's a cheater, that the system protects him. You know, they rob other fighters in his favor. Let's say he's a dirty fighter in the ring. He doesn't follow the rules. He could be a complete and utter scumbag, cheater in the sport of boxing, but simply because he's Mexican, simply because nationalism, people will support him. A lot of people still will. Where's the virtue in that, right? Where's the virtue in that? That doesn't have any virtue, and that's why nationalism is such a, it's a pitfall. It's a problem, right? It's a banana peel skin because it's not based in virtue. It isn't. Shouldn't the things we do, right, the way we relate with one another, shouldn't they be virtuous? You believe they should be, which is why you paint nationalism as virtuous when it isn't. It's not virtuous. I'm not saying that nationalism couldn't lead to virtue, right? But shouldn't virtue come before nationalism? That's what I'm saying. And just maybe, if you're lucky, for all you nationalists, just as much as nationalism may lead to virtuous actions, it also leads to completely and utterly devoid of virtue evil actions too, right? So to paint nationalism as something virtuous at its core is to completely ignore reality, right? Of what it actually is. You could say you want it to be what you want it to be, but what is it actually, right? You could say, Walker or Connor, that nationalism is yada, 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 right? But the reason why you're in the minority is because most people realize reality for what it actually is. And nationalism isn't what you're saying in most cases, because it's mostly not virtuous. This is just the world we live in. And the reason why people get lost in this and don't realize the pitfalls of something like nationalism, the problems with nationalism, is because it's not based in reason or logic. It's just based in a fucking feeling. And then you try to reverse engineer reality and try to paint nationalism as virtuous when we see that it mostly isn't, unfortunately, right? But it shouldn't be that difficult to understand that you're okay with doing that when at the core of nationalism is fucking myth. It is whatever I say it is, right? It's not. It's not virtuous in and of itself. It isn't. It's not based in virtue. I don't know. I hope that makes sense. It makes sense to me. That's why I don't support nationalism. And the first and foremost reason why is because I prefer to rationalize things before I feel. I'm not saying feelings are unimportant, that we should all be callous and whatever, right? Even though I also admit that I am that to a certain degree, very cynical too. And I think you would be too if you were in my shoes. But the question I would always ask is, well, are your feelings justified, right? Anyone could feel anything, and it's good to feel. Don't get me wrong, but are your feelings justified? And insofar as nationalism, as it stands today, that feeling is not justified, in my opinion. It just isn't. Because I think if you dig deep down and far enough, far back enough, and you don't start questioning nationalism, where it came from, why it's such a very, very recent phenomenon, right? Then I don't think you're being rational. I think you're just feeling, right? And it makes sense that nationalism would make sense in a world where that action based first and foremost on feelings, right? In a world that even you right wing wokes will admit is being increasingly feminized, right? Now, this isn't anything against women because, again, yin and yang, you know what I mean? We need that too, don't get me wrong. But again, are your feelings justified? Are they rational, right? And I just don't see that. And yeah, just looking at, no offense to anyone, I'm going to get a little bit crude here, but this is just me venting. When I see these nationalistic rallies with people waving flags, yelling and screaming, right, with some one person at the mic egging them on and shit, right? Do you know what I see? A bunch of bitches. It is what it is. Thanks for watching.